that they must use, if you must consider that they must be able to use a computer and the internet, the trick is twofold. You have to get a screen reader, that is an engine that can translate from text to speech. And if somebody has low vision, then you can use what we call a screen magnifier, so that somebody with limited sight is able to read the text that is displayed on the screen. That is visual impairment. The challenge here is that these softwares are usually very expensive. However, the good news is that in some of the gadgets that we use today, we already have some low-level kind of screen readers and screen magnifiers that we can use for that particular disability. For example, if you are using an iPhone, you will have something called VoiceOver or a screen reader, and you also have something called Zoom or a screen magnifier. Those are really good enough without you incurring an extra cost to buy a third-party screen reader. The only problem is that an iPhone itself is very expensive and maybe not affordable by so many people. But the other good news is that we have other open source solutions for this particular disability. And one of them, in terms of a screen reader, is called NVDA, which is the non-desktop, non-visual desktop access, which you can download and install on gadgets that use Windows, and you'll be able to use it for most of the functions that will require you for digital. And
all right, thanks, Dr. Abdul. I think I'll let Paul.
A screen reader, which
sorry, Dr. Abdul, your connection is a bit, it's kind of breaking off. So I'll let Paul.
Now
Sorry, Dr. Abdul, let me just bring in Paul to, take up the rest of the question, tackling the extra cost that comes with the uniqueness of the different disabilities that we have. Paul.
Thank you, Ian. I think just to add on what Dr. Abdul has been talking about is, of course, technology itself is very expensive, but also when you add in the extra cost of the software that you need, that doubles or more than triples the cost. And as I think Dr. Msipa has mentioned, many of our people who are living with disabilities do not have the financial muscles to be able to afford, nor even the digital literacy levels to be able to afford, but also utilize some of these technologies that are emerging. And so that brings in extra costs. One, financial, that the people cannot afford, and can their caregivers also afford these extra cost of facilities. And also, I don't know if I would be jumping onto the next topic or that you have or to anticipate, but in many instances, even the service providers have not made it easy for these technologies to be easily accessible. For example, if you look at most of the telecom service providers, in that even if you want to buy a phone, a feature phone, they may not be available in the sales outlets. And for personal stability, you will look at most of the outlets, they are not easily accessible. So if you have a phone, you want some technical advice, you want input, you are not going to be able to access some of these physical places where they are located, and that maybe they don't have ramps, or if they are on the third floor, you cannot use your wheelchair to access these places. So it becomes very, so even if you have the money, the physical places are not exactly available. And I think the other thing I want to mention is that even as the community, we have also not made conscious decisions to make ourselves or the services that we offer accessible to persons with disabilities. And I think Dr. Busuulwa was mentioning that there are people, of course, who are blind, and the others who have difficulties in seeing. And I'm talking about email communication even between us as colleagues. A lot of times we assume because I can see the font size, I use font 12. So every email that I must write, I am assuming that my audience or my readers are able to see the font size 12. And we know that as you age, as you reach 60, reach 70, your vision starts to continues to blur. So are we able, again, to make sure that we subsidize indirectly so that we don't, our colleagues do not have to buy, but we make sure that as we write to our colleagues, we make a conscious decision that the font size that we are using is 14 or bigger for that matter. So we don't make these assumptions.
Yeah, I'm coming back to you, Paul, shortly. I can see a couple of hands raised. Kindly use the chat box to just drop in the questions. Dr. Abdul, I'll come to you, but I'd like Paul to take on this question from O'Neill. He says, how can we meaningfully mainstream disability inclusion in our programming, considering new challenges such as deaf blindness, which affects 2 sensory organs?
Number one, so who are you programming for? If you are programming to make sure that you reach persons with disability, then this group must be involved in your programming. If you are providing accessible devices, so are you able to interact with them and understand their unique challenges and their needs? Because a lot of times as programmers, we sit in our offices and think, or even read online, read reports that have been published by CIPESA and others, and I think we understand the issues or challenges that persons with disabilities are facing. So are you able to make an extra effort to reach out to the different groups that you are targeting? If it is people living with blindness, are you able to reach out to them and have a decent conversation with them, okay, asking them what are the unique challenges that you are facing, and then how can we intervene? Are you able to reach out to the telecom service providers and ask them what services are you providing and why you are not providing these services, and then have a discussion there? It will be very easy for you to come up with programs that are relevant and that are satisfactory to the audience that you are serving.
Thank you, Paul, for taking that question. We actually have another one from an anonymous attendee who will, in fact, bring us to the next part of the discussion, which is policy. Anonymous attendee asks, how can government support digital inclusion in terms of legislation and policy development? I'm going to bring in Titilola Olatunde to just take that from a legal perspective and even policy. How can government support digital inclusion in terms of legislation and policy development?
Okay, so thank you, Helen, for the question. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear, thank you.
Okay, so governments can ensure that the policies they are going to pass, and of course the laws align to bring in digital inclusion, more so because they are the policy makers, and being the policy makers, they should be the persons in the driver's seats to drive the implementation, of these laws and policies. As you would see across, the countries of the world, I will use Nigeria as a case study. Nigeria has the National Commission for Persons with Disability in Nigeria. And that commission is necessarily put together to drive, anything that has to do with persons with disability. But you would also realize that this commission cannot work alone. They need to collaborate, with other ministries and other agencies. So I'll give an instance. There is a policy passed, but to implement this policy, the commission needs to work with the Ministry of Education to ensure that persons are educated as to their rights, to ensure that even persons that are not disabled are educated about the rights of persons that are disabled and how to handle them. Now, they also need to work with persons that are working in the Ministry of Transport to ensure that the persons manning the various public transport systems understand the rights of the disabled person, ensure that it is implemented, and those persons do not feel left out, during the course, of the implementation. I guess for me, I would say that for the government, to ensure that this policy is implemented, one thing government needs to do is to ensure that they do not just make the policy for the disabled people, but they make it with them. And what do I mean by them making it with them? Involve them in the policy making. Don't necessarily just pass a policy that might not even achieve, the very aim to, for passing it in the first place. Involve them. And more so, if I could take it back to the earlier question I asked, about software and all, if you involve persons that are disabled, they know how these programs work for them. They know how these policies work for them. They know how, the lacunas in it. And then they give you it's just like when you roll out a program, you're a commercial, you're a businessman, you want to roll out a program and you go out to do more like a market survey. So for me, it's more like a market survey. You ensure that you are indeed meeting the need you intend, to meet at the time of passing those policies. So I think for me, there should be a large scale collaboration between the government agencies, within the government agencies, with persons that are, directly affected with these disabilities, and of course, with the persons, that would work with them that are not even disabled. So for me, it has to be a large-scale collaboration across board. And finally,
why do you think there's been that, gap, or rather that lack of synergy between government involving different stakeholders, specifically the people we're talking about today?
I think is because number one, when we look at digitalization, and I will use Nigeria again, I think it's been more driven by private companies and entities than government. And I would say that the few policies that are put in place or laws that are put in place to even drive it are a bit limited. And so let me use Nigeria. We have the new Copyright Act, and the new Copyright Act now has a section that says you can bring all of these copyright products into accessible formats, for disabled persons. However, for you to bring it into accessible format, it must be for a non-profit. Now, this non-profit organization possibly have, the zeal, the drive to make this happen. But have you put in policies to encourage them in that light? What kind of policies? Tax-related policies that would enable them, to really put their investment into this accessible formats, for the disabled persons, tax holidays, for even the commercial companies that want to get involved, in making accessible digitalization for the disabled person. So these are all the things government needs to begin to put in place beyond just passing the law. Ensure that you make it accessible for even the persons that want to invest in it, because the truth of it is an investment. I think it was Paul that alluded to it, that says that it is quite expensive, to either the software or even to bring in the programming. So if these persons want to put in their funds, on behalf of the government, indeed taking the burden of government, then there should be, some form of relief for them in the long run. And if those policies are only restricted to oil, to cement, to food products, then to a very large extent, you have very few persons, interested in putting their funds in such investments.
Thank you, Titilola. I'll come back to you. Now, there's a very interesting question from Pino Ivan, and I'll have Dr. Dianah respond to this because she earlier introduced us to the barriers of digital inclusion. And the question says, tech is being developed without the African rural person being inclusive, especially when it comes to the language. How can this be bridged and made more inclusive? Dr. Dianah.
Thank you so much for that question. I think that is a good question. A lot of the times we speak about the exclusion of persons with disabilities generally, but it's also important to note that persons with disabilities in rural areas are even more excluded than other persons with disabilities in, let's say, the urban areas. And I think to answer the question as to what can be done to ensure that persons with disabilities in the rural areas are included, I think, number one, it takes a conscious effort on the part of service providers, you know, things like mobile network providers, etc., etc. They have to make a conscious effort to ensure that they're including persons with disabilities that are in rural areas. This includes, as you say, overcoming language barriers by maybe translating some of their adverts, making sure they're in maybe sign language, etc., and other accessible formats. But I think also sometimes there is a lack of maybe will on the part of service providers because of how much it would cost them to roll out these programs and services in rural areas. So I think this is where laws and policies come in. And I think governments then have a role to make it mandatory for these service providers to ensure that they cover also persons with disabilities living in rural areas. Thank you.
Yeah. And Dr. Dianah, before I let you go, we have a very interesting question coming from South Africa, and this is being asked by Bakwena Manoto, who says, "Hi, El, we are an ISP that installs affordable Wi-Fi in the townships of South Africa. Is there any advice from the panel that we can get to be more inclusive?" Dr. Dianah, what do you think?
To make their Wi-Fi more inclusive, is that the question?
Yes. So let me just read it again. We're an ISP that installs affordable Wi-Fi in the townships of South Africa. Is there any advice from the panel to be more inclusive?
Okay, yes. So I think my advice would be what usually happens in these sorts of circumstances is there's usually a communication break. So you are a service provider, you are providing services that is cheap, right? But what you will find most of the time is that the persons with disabilities in that area won't even know about it, mainly because the advertisements go out probably in inaccessible formats, maybe just in English or in written formats, etc., etc. There's no braille, there's no sign language interpretation. So I think you have to rethink maybe the advertising strategy. You have to think about advertising on radio in various languages. You have to think about television advertisements. You have to think about sign language. You have to also think about what is known as easy to read or easy to understand language. So this is for persons with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. So some of the terminology will be too complex for persons with those types of disabilities to understand. So you need an advert that is placed in what is called simple language. So I would say that's one of the practical ways that you can ensure inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dianah. That was well answered. Let me bring in Ahouty because we have an interesting question, and you kind of gave us success stories of the programs that you've implemented. So John Daniel has a question here, and he says, how can NGOs engage to collaborate with with agencies to help the people with disabilities access community banking as an initiative to these people due to other living in extreme poverty? I hope I read that question clearly. Ahouty, you could read it more on the chat, but I'll try to read it again. How can NGOs engage to collaborate with your agencies to help the people with disabilities to access community banking as an initiative to these people due to other living in extreme poverty? Ahouty, did you get that? Or would you like John to rephrase it?
Hello. Okay, I'll try to answer this question. I think that it is not easy because most of people with disabilities are jobless. They have no employment. There are not enough resources, and generally, bank institution cannot offer opportunities to these people because for them, they are not financially reliable. And so in our context, you have what we call community microfinance. Community microfinance is a program that teach people with disabilities on how we can create the small businesses, how we can save money, and how we can undertake. It is a program that prepare people with disabilities to be the future entrepreneurs in order to give an orientation in their life, in order to invest and create revenue. I think it is in such context that a bank institution can take into account people with disabilities that live in extreme poverty, because this will allow them to have an activity that will bring them money and allow them the habit to save. And it is in such a way that the bank institution can incorporate them and can accept them. We have tried to, in our context, to sensitize bank institution in order to support people with disabilities that have innovative ideas. That the problem is that bank institutions told us that these people are not financially independent in order to get money, in order to have the possibilities to get funding from the bank institution. So I think we must collaborate we must work in synergy as any NGOs in order to allow the bank institution and give them all the guarantees that people with disabilities can undertake activity. And why not? You can coach the people with disabilities, and also you can become the guarantees. It is in that context that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll throw the next question to Paul, because as CIPESA, I'm sure you've interacted with quite a number of platforms, including, Facebook and other social media. We have a question from Prozi Kawala, who says, what role can platforms play in ensuring digital inclusion specific to persons with disabilities? Example, can platforms like Facebook embed functions that compute created content into formats accessible by PWDs? Paul, would you take that briefly, please?
Thanks. Yes, platform organizations actually have a responsibility to ensure that all their services are accessible, and not just because one, they do a lot of things. So providing the services, providing the internet, also the platform where people interact. So they have the responsibility, and I think several of them have started, especially setting up disability and diversity inclusion programs within their structure. Especially Google has. Facebook and Meta haven't interacted with them much, but I believe they are thinking about it, but they are supposed to. And yeah, one thing also I want to just mention briefly that was discussed by Dr. Busuulwa and Dr. Msipa is about the screen readers and plain language and simple language, as I think Dr. Dianah referred to them. So screen readers are very important software that are used by people with the audio impairments to make sure that the text they're accessing is accessible. But screen readers are complicated software, so they work only if the text and the text that they are reading is in accessible format. So if you so you may have a screen reader, but it may not be able to read for you, especially for a website, especially because they are programmed to follow a certain structure. So if you are using an image in your document and the image has no heading, then the screen reader will look at that image as something that is decorative. So it will not be able to interpret. If you have a table that has no heading, and you see when you're making that heading, you don't write it. There is a way you right click on the table and then follow the dialog box and say include write alternative text. So screen readers work, but then you must make sure that the text that the screen is going to read is also in an accessible format.
All right, thanks for that, Paul. I've just seen that Dr. Karen Smit has joined us. She had said she would join us a little bit later, but thank you very much, Dr. Karen Smit. She is the accessibility lead public affairs at Vodacom South Africa. So Dr. Karen, a question for you, because technology is really the center of what we're discussing here. What emerging technologies have the potential to significantly enhance digital inclusion for persons with disabilities? And of course, as a service provider, you can talk about what you're doing on your end.
Thanks for that question. Thanks for having me. Yes, I just heard Paul talk about screen reader software. So that has been absolutely critical for people with visual impairments, people that are completely blind, that rely on screen reader software in their devices. And here I always applaud global handset manufacturers or device manufacturers such as Apple, such as Google, for actually including the needs of people with different disabilities into their operating systems. So, you know, whether you're visually impaired, physically disabled, or hearing impaired, you don't have to do anything separate. When you purchase that device, it's got the accessibility features. So that is you know, that's something that we advocate as a mobile network operator to our customers, because there's a lot of education to do as well. Sometimes these accessibility features exist within mainstream devices, and especially somebody that, for example, becomes visually impaired, let's say recently, they don't know about all of these accessibility functions that are available. So obviously ongoing awareness raising is very critical, and that is something that we do all the time. We engage with disabled people's organizations as our key stakeholders to then you know, even partner with them to support them with smart digi-centers, for example, digital skills, to enhance that. But I also just want to say, we know that currently AI is a very big topic. It's been around for a long time, but we can see it's going to another level. So as all of these technologies increase, we can also see that it will benefit people with disabilities. For example, there's the Be My Eyes app that you can go and read up about how it uses AI. Microsoft also uses AI a lot. Then we've got VR, even smart cities going forward in the future to smart cities will also benefit people with disabilities. And then self-driving cars. I've got a colleague that is blind, and he will always say to me, you know, Karen, when we visit each other one day in the future, then I can actually say to you that I will pick you up, you know, and that's creating that sense of independence. Improved captioning on devices for hearing impaired people. I mean, all of us, when we're in meetings or on a plane or wherever, we rely so much on captioning of videos. And then also a great example is Microsoft that include accessibility features whenever you buy a Microsoft Office package. You know, it's so accessible, and it, you can use it, and it just makes the lives easy for everybody, especially people with disabilities. So I just want to say on this emerging technologies, of course, people with disabilities, their needs must be taken into account upfront. Else there's the risk that you could then still increase the digital divide. And at Vodacom, we are working hard to provide accessible products and services to narrow that divide across, not just in South Africa, but in Safaricom in Kenya. They have done a lot of work in this space. For example, the M-Pesa is accessible for blind people. And in Tanzania, we've got accessible call centers. whereby persons that use sign language, they can go into our Tanzania stores, even in South Africa, and they can be helped by sign language interpreters that we then employ as consultants. So I can go on with this topic for a long time, but I think in a nutshell, that is what Vodacom has been doing. And all I want to say is that any technology obviously benefits people with disability, but it's got to be intentional, because we don't want to, you know, when we've launched this, then not upfront take their needs into account. So Ian, it's got to be upfront. That is what it's about. It's about that systemic inclusion.
Dr. Karen, and just a quick one before I let you go on this one.
Yes.
One of the barriers that have been said to digital inclusion is obviously the cost of gadgets and the cost of data.
Yes.
Is this something that you are tackling as Vodacom?
Yes. If you look at our annual reports that we produce, you will notice how the price of data is continuing to decrease all the time. Of course, you know, it's something that still needs to decrease, but we have been doing it for the last couple of years. And then also, if you look at devices, the great thing about devices is a lot of the smartphones is the price has been decreasing. So if we look at what a smartphone, some of the makes, like the Vodafone Kicker, we can sell an accessible Vodafone Kicker phone for around about 600 Rand. And then that phone can even be used by visually impaired persons. So we've done a lot of work in that space as well. So, but having said that, obviously, if you look at GSMA reports that was just produced and all other research reports, you will see that affordability in developing countries is, you know, an issue for everybody. But yes, so we have wins on that, but definitely areas where, you know, that we will keep on seeing what can be done more.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Smit. I'm going to take two more questions before we move into the launch section of this event. And I'll bring in Dr. Abdul, because actually, before I bring in Dr. Abdul, because you'll be speaking in the next session anyway, let me bring in Titilola to take on this question. What can be done in order to ensure that persons with disabilities access reliable information, and especially in risk-related issues, including pandemic and natural disasters? This is coming from Emmanuel Rossio. Titilola, do you mind taking that, please?
Can you take the question again?
So Emmanuel is asking, what can be done in order to ensure that persons with disabilities access reliable information, and especially in risk-related issues, including pandemic and natural disasters? Because this is almost leaning towards a policy perspective. What do you think?
Okay, so I mean, persons with disabilities during pandemic or even during their daily living, should have access to information. And indeed, to a very large extent, the availability of telephone, more so in the GSM itself, has helped to alleviate these issues to a very large extent. But I guess the issues are how accessible are this information? Are they accessible to the persons that are visually impaired? Are they accessible to the persons, that have hearing impairment? And so I believe that this, in this instance, will not just be government policies, because this, to a very large extent, we think technology at every point in time will solve the problem. But at times, it's not just technology that we need. We need all hands on deck. So we need even a cultural, innovation in our communities. So if we can get the inclusion, and so when you say inclusion, when we talk about digital inclusion, it's not just having to include, the persons that have these disabilities, but even persons, that in the various sector in the community. So information, when you think about information, what do you think about? Media, right? So you want to tell yourself that people in the media should be inclusive, in the way they share the information. That is when I want to listen to the news as someone that do not have any form of disability, I expect I should be clear and that the other, I should be able to hear them. Now, the person that has disability would expect that there should be some form of sign language so that I can at least see the sound language and invariably be able to listen in. Or there should be some form of audio to text. What do we call it now? We call it subtitle. So if I'm listening to the news, there should be some form of subtitling that even though I cannot hear, I can actually follow the news, even though it is in the audio format, it's placed in the format I can hear. So I believe it's not just the government policy itself, but culturally, cut across the communities, there should be that inclusion. Don't just intend your service for a majority, but for the entire populace at large. And so I believe inclusion across board, not just government, is what is required here.
Thank you very much, Titilola. Now, I can see a couple of questions coming in. We just want to move to the next session. And if time allows, we shall definitely come to that. But I'd also like to ask my panelists to please respond to the chat boxes on any question that you think you do have an answer to. Now, remember, one of the main reasons we're here today, other than, of course, observing the International Day for Persons with Disabilities, we're also, CIPESA rather, who is the main convener of this event, is launching the Disability and ICT Accessibility Framework Indicators. And I would like to invite Paul Kimumwe from CIPESA to just take us through the process of what and how we got here, after which we shall be speaking to Dr. Abdul Busuulwa and Morgan Frost from CIPE.
Thanks, Ian. So these indicators, I don't know if somebody can show the first page of the indicators as I speak about them. But I can start my brief remarks. So in 2019, we started 2018, 2019 at CIPESA when we were trying to introduce ourselves to the work on digital disability, digitization and disability. So we had discussions with several stakeholders on how to develop work around and advocate for the inclusion of people with disability in our digital work. And one of the things that we noticed as we're doing research and having those conversations is that there existed a lot of frameworks that we're trying to assess how countries, governments, different players. I think you can just project the title page. Different, because I'm not going to follow what you are scrolling. How different countries were trying to implement, particularly the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability. And we also know that several countries across the continent had enacted the laws that were specifically providing for the rights of persons with disabilities. And in there, we noted that there had been some steps within these laws that included the provision for ICTs and access to information. The biggest challenge then was, and I think still now, it was that many of these provisions were not implemented, and nobody was holding the countries accountable or the governments accountable. For example, for many countries, their television providers and telecom providers are required by law to ensure that their services are accessible to persons with disability. Specifically for television, they are supposed to ensure that their programming are accessible. But we note that for many television stations, they only include sign language or subtitles for the main bulletins, and that is normally 1 hour. So the rest of the programs are really not accessible for persons with disability. So we're trying to understand how best can we ensure that, one, we promote accessibility across most of these organizations and telecom companies, television stations, but also in government. And the areas that we wanted to focus on then were that we wanted to ensure that, one, the legal and policy frameworks are in sync with the CRPD. The national laws are also in sync with the CRPD, but also with the mandate of the international legal frameworks on access to information and persons with disability. And then that even the subsidiary laws, the provisions that are within the subsidiary laws that provide for accessibility of their services are also, one, in sync, but also that they are implemented. So 2019, we developed the first framework, which was looking at 6 areas. Number one, the legal and policy frameworks. Number two was the accessibility of public service providers. Number 3, we're looking at the private mobile communication providers. Number 4, we're looking at television providers. And number 5, we're looking at web accessibility. And then number 6 were the procurement policies that were in these countries. And with those frameworks, we did a study that covered 5 countries and 10 telecom service providers. And from the findings of that study, it was clear that one, the laws are existing, much as they have gaps, but at least they have existing laws. The biggest challenge was the implementation. For the telecom companies also, they were required, but they were not implementing. Most of their services were inaccessible. One, the sales outlets did not have accessible places. And even then, the services that we're offering were not accessible to many people with disabilities and the different disabilities that you can think about. They didn't have ramps, the patients were inaccessible, they didn't have feature phones, the staff were not trained to provide services for access, provide services for persons with disability. And so one of the things that we thought we needed to probably change, because the frameworks were designed to generate information that then can be used for advocacy. And of course, we received a lot of feedback about the frameworks from the researchers. Some of the questions and the tools that we're using were not generating enough information or credible information that we need to analyze. So we would get the information, but it's not easy to analyze. And so last year, we again discussed with partners, and here I can mention CIPE, telling them we needed to we need to revise the framework to make sure it is accessible itself in terms of the simplicity of the language used, but also in terms of ease, so that not only academicians can be able, or people who are skilled in research and analytics can use the framework to assess, but also that even organizations, even rural organizations, can be able to utilize the frameworks, one, to assess the compliance of their countries across the continent, but also can follow up, can be able to assess and analyze the different laws within their countries that have an effect on persons with disability, and they may use the information that's generated. It is easy to understand, it is easy to interpret and write reports, but also develop advocacy strategies around digital inclusion. And so that process started last year, and we zeroed down from the 6 indicators. We now have 5 indicators. Number 1, we retain the legal and policy frameworks, because as we've been discussing, laws are very important because they provide a starting point for discussions and including persons with disabilities. So we are looking at the international legal frameworks, we are looking at the national legal frameworks, we are looking at the subsidiary policies within the country. So one of the questions that the indicators is asking is, has the country ratified any of these international instruments that provide for accessibility? First of all, we are looking at the CRPD, and then of course the SCCRP, and then of course at the continental level we have the different protocols, and even nationally we have the constitution. Many of the constitutions that we have on the continent provide for rights for persons with disability, but also different countries have gone ahead and enacted specific laws for rights of persons with disability. So we are looking at the different laws, if they have provisions that provide access of ICTs and for persons with disability. So that indicator and framework is trying to ask the compliance. One, does the country signed and ratified the international frameworks, but also at national level, does the constitution provide, and how clear is the language in the provision? Because in the legal matters, one, the language matters, because when they say the minister shall or the minister may, they may have different interpretations. Thank you very much. And so we are looking at the different laws, even the language. And so are these laws, do they conform to the international frameworks? And are they clear enough? Can they be implemented? Then once that question is answered, so one, again, if I may go back, what we try to do is to simplify the research process. So we provided the guidance on how the researchers can go about some of these questions, particularly in finding out. So if you're analyzing the different laws, one of the questions we ask you is to compare the provisions within the CRPD and the language within the national legal frameworks. If one, the language is clear, so that it's not confusing, because if the language is vague, then it is prone to misinterpretation, or you may not even easily hold the government accountable because of the language that they use. Because I think one time we had a discussion and a controversy within Parliament in Uganda, where the Minister of ICT drafted regulations and did not lay them for Parliament because the interpretation was the minister may. So government was arguing that it is their prerogative either to lay the instruments or not to. But if the language had been that the minister shall, then that would provide an obligation for them to lay the instruments before Parliament for approval. So we are looking at the language within these legal frameworks and the policy frameworks. If it is one compliant enough and it facilitates monitoring and accountability. The second framework that we are looking at is the accessibility of the public providers. In many countries, we have providers mobile services, but also we have governments. So we are also assessing the accessibility and compliance of these government facilities. Number three, we are looking at the private service providers, the MTNs of this world, Safaricom, Airtel. One of the questions that we are asking about the compliance of these telecom companies and private providers is one, to how accessible are their services? So do they have programs that provide for accessibility of their services for persons with disability? How are their sales points located? Are their staff trained to deal with clients who have disabilities? Do they have gadgets within their sales outlets that are accessible? Do they have the technical expertise to provide for services of persons with disability? And do they have policies? Because also we want to understand, do they have a policy framework within as an organization? Are they doing deliberate efforts to train and capacitate their staff? So because this guides on how they implement their projects. So for telecom companies, those are the questions we are looking at. And same applies to television organizations, which is the fourth area that we are looking at. Many laws, especially on telecom, where television companies are licensed, they are required, as I mentioned, to ensure that the programming is accessible. So we're also asking one, how far are they implementing this legal requirement? And also, do they have staff who are able to understand and report about persons with disabilities? Are their programming accessible, as Titilola mentioned? Are their programming accessible? Do they have subtitles? Do they have audio provisions? And so these are some of these questions that we're asking. Then the last one, which is web accessibility. We are looking at both government and private sector web accessibility. So as you may know, I think, during the COVID pandemic, it became very clear that the online presence is very important and a very important arena for meaningful and civic participation. Because of COVID, many things went online. So websites and online platforms have become very important arenas of inclusion and participation. So one of the key areas that we're trying to understand is how accessible are these websites and online platforms. Of course, we are focusing on government mainly because they are the duty bearers. But one area that we are using to assess the accessibility of the websites is the web content guidelines that were developed by the World Consortium. So those are the criteria that we are using to assess how accessible are the websites. And so again, we provide guidance for researchers. So if you are to assess the web accessibility of websites, one, we recommend that you use the web content accessibility guidelines because they are very clear. They also provide areas of improvement. So are you able, and there are different tools, software online that you can use. So one of the tools that we recommend is the Web Accessibility in Mind. It's called Web AIM. So it is an online tool. And so you can just get your URL and dump it, if I may use that word, into that tool. So it will be able to generate for you to assess how accessible your website is. And also this helps you in terms of how do you improve your accessibility, because many times you build a website and you think it is accessible, it has very good images, it has very good text, but it's not accessible. And if you are pretending to be working and serving persons with disability, you need to make deliberate efforts to ensure that one, whatever tool, whatever product, whatever document you are putting out is really accessible. So for the other indicators, we are recommending that one, you can conduct interviews. So interview the leadership of the organizations, the television companies, the mobile telephone companies, go and speak with them about their policies on accessibility, how they're implementing. We also recommend that you visit these places, you visit the sales outlets to observe for yourself so that you don't just rely on the responses from the leadership. Visit the places. Also, talk to the persons with disabilities who are clients of these organizations, people who are watching TV, because the manager might say that our programs are accessible. So can you go and interview the people who are watching and understand what are the unique challenges that they are facing in terms of accessing the content of these television programs? For telecom companies, as I mentioned, visit the sales outlets, interview the salespersons if they have the necessary skills, because once the manager might say, we have trained our staff to provide services for persons with disability, but are you able to interview these individuals to understand if the training, one, had an impact, but also if the training took place, because we don't want you to just believe what they are saying. So we are giving you this tool, but also giving guidelines on how to implement this tool. And one of the things we didn't do is to rank the performance of the different entities, because ranking is good, but also it creates several resistances. So we just want to work with individual entities to make sure that they improve. So we are working in partnership. So this tool can be used, one, by the telecom companies themselves to assess whether their disability and accessibility programs are working, the television companies to assess whether their disability and accessibility programs are working, also the website builders, and also government. And also people who are doing advocacy around disability, they can use this framework and the tool to assess. So you can choose an indicator that works for you, because the tool is quite big, 5 indicators are many. So you can choose an indicator that works for you, that is within your ambit of expertise, and work with that. And as CIPESA, we are available and we are willing to work with you to train you on how to use the accessibility tool, but also to help you in analyzing the data to make it more meaningful, and so that it can be used for advocacy purposes. But before I conclude, of course, once we launch, it will be accessible to all of you for downloading and adapting to your needs. I want to say that we had a lot of consultations on this tool as a CIPESA. Of course, 5 years or 6 years in disability work is really a short time, so we are learning, but we are reading a lot and we are relying on experts like Dr. Msipa, Dr. Karen, who are really, Dr. Busuulwa, who are really supporting and guiding us. But also we subjected this framework to meetings and validation workshops. And so we had a lot of input. And I should say that this is a living document. So every once in a while, it will be amended, it will be revised to ensure that, one, it complies with the different developments, but also disability language keeps on changing and the needs keeps on changing. So we are alive to that fact, and we'll be making sure that these revisions are taken into account, and the reports that are generated from the framework are utilized to ensure that we advocate for meaningful policies and laws. And of course, we know that television companies and the telecom companies have challenges, because investing in services that provide for persons with disability may not seem so profitable, but there are big numbers of people with disabilities. I think the World Education Report says it's about 1.3 billion people. And many times we tend to look at people with only who are completely blind, but there are people who, many of us are struggling with the visuals. That's why we wear glasses, because we are not able to see. If I put off my glasses, I'm not able to see. But because now maybe I can afford, but every now and then as I age, I need glasses that are stronger. So we need to be working together with these companies and make sure that this tool is not condemning them, but we are working together to identify the key gaps and challenges, and then we develop programs that work to ensure that we are supporting a digital inclusivity. And just before I conclude, just to remind you that the theme for this year's International Day for Persons with Disability is rescuing and achieving the SDGs, because it is 7 years to 2030, and we are halfway, and we are still facing many challenges as countries, as organizations, to ensure that by 2030 we have achieved certain targets that are supposed to be ensure that persons with disabilities are not left behind. Yeah, I think Ian, I can stop there for now. The tool is quite complex, but we are trying to make sure that we organize different engagements where we can try and work with people who are interested to simplify it for them.
All right, thank you very much for that, Paul. I'm going to bring in Morgan Frost, who will just talk to us on the importance of the key indicators that Paul has just talked to us about. Paul is from the Center for the International Private Enterprise. Morgan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian, and good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Morgan Frost. I'm a consultant for the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE. Perhaps just by way of brief background, so CIPE is one of the 4 core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy and an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We strengthen democracy around the globe through private enterprise and market-oriented reform, and we do this in partnership with local private sector and civil society organizations throughout emerging and frontier markets. So CIPE specifically has decades of experience in supporting partners to implement projects focused on economic inclusion. So that can mean advancing gender equality to build more inclusive, thriving economies and democracies. But also in recent years, we've initiated lines of programming focused on advancing the inclusion of persons with disabilities, working with partners in countries such as Moldova and Papua New Guinea. And of course, we've also had the absolute pleasure of supporting CIPESA to advance their ongoing initiatives on digital inclusion for persons with disabilities. I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate CIPESA and all the stakeholders that contributed to the development of the Disability and ICT Accessibility Framework. From our perspective, ensuring that all segments of society have equal opportunities to participate socially, economically, and politically online is absolutely essential in protecting human rights in the digital age. And we're really looking forward to learning about how different researchers and organizations from across the continent will utilize this tool going forward. Ian, if I may just provide a quick note on the indicators themselves before passing it back to you. They really do provide an important framework, again, for researchers and organizations to assess the gaps in legislation and also accessibility that hinder the full participation of persons with disabilities in digital spaces. So the information gathered from the tool can also provide a foundation for civil society, the local private sector, academia, and government to really come together to examine how to collaborate with one another to advance digital inclusion for all. And we really hope that this is also an opportunity to enhance cross-regional learning and cross-country learning for organizations who are committed to advancing digital inclusion for persons with disabilities. Perhaps I'll stop there, Ian. Thank you so much for the invitation.
All right, thank you very much for that, Morgan. Now I'm going to call Dr. Abdul, who is going to give his remarks about the Disability and ICT Accessibility Framework Indicators and officially launch it. Dr. Abdul, over to you. Dr. Abdul, can you hear me?
I'd gone off, eh? Hello?
Yes, but we can hear you now.
Yeah, I'd gone off, but now I think I'm on. You know, I'm in a rural area in the north here, northern Uganda.
Okay,
but
we can hear you loud and clear now.
Okay, now you ask the question because I dropped off for at least a minute or two.
Yes, so it's now your turn to just take us through your quick comments about the launch of the Disability and ICT Accessibility Framework Indicators, and you can declare it launched officially once you're done.
Okay, now, this is a very beautiful innovation. And I'm not speaking like this because I'm a board member of CIPESA, but I'm speaking like this because I'm a person with ability and an expert on accessibility of ICT. You realize that when we were starting this journey in 2019, there were so many challenges around accessibility in terms of telecom companies. Some of them were not aware of what to do. Even the television companies, the same. But then, that with the time, because of the awareness that has been created, the things are a bit changing. And then with the new indicators, the revisions, you realize that you cannot only rely on hearsay, what people want to tell us, but that observation is very, very important. And then also the guidelines on what should be done by the researchers is also a very useful innovation to make these guidelines practical and achieve the aim that we want to achieve in terms of accessibility, data accessibility. You know, for a long time, the argument has been that disability doesn't make economic argument. It is not digital accessibility is not marketable in terms of ICT. But then, even if you have very few people that are not getting the services that you're providing, I think it's only useful that you cater for them as well. So these indicators are helping the different service providers to know what actually is possible, what can be done to ensure that accessibility is achieved for the different types of people with disabilities. That's very, very important because we are in the information age, and you cannot imagine that people with disabilities don't need information. And you cannot imagine that information that they need can only be got offline. Many times we get information online, and this should be inclusive of people with disabilities. Our hope is that as we go deeper into using these indicators, there should be a situation where different countries can set up accessibility boards or accessibility standard boards so that there are people are monitoring accessibility, digital accessibility from time to time, and they are recognized by the different governments or different players within those countries. And therefore, it will become very easy for us to say that whatever recommendations the researchers will make, we are sure that they will be implemented, and we are sure that the implementation take place. There are people that are going to monitor to see how effectively these recommendations are being implemented in the different service providers. Because awareness has been one of the major problems in terms of the digital divide and digital inclusion, followed closely with something called negative attitude. You know, when people are negative about something, they will not endeavor even to learn what it is involving. And secondly, they will not do what it takes to improve the situation. So with the legal framework in place, with the people to enforce that legal framework, we hope situations in the different countries will begin to change, and we have more accessibility in the digital world. I think those are the comments I want to make in addition to what Paul has been telling the audience.
Right, thank you very much for that, Dr. Paul. And I guess following him speaking, the Disability and ICT Accessibility Framework Indicators has now officially been launched. Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to call on Paul to give final remarks. And there's a couple of questions here. Maybe you could take one or two because they involve CIPESA. For instance, Linda Burudi is asking, as CIPESA, what steps are you taking to make sure that the disabled who work in local media stations are comfortable? We also have Immaculate Wasonga who says, as an organization, what steps are you taking to make sure even the disabled who work in local media stations, I think that's more or less the same question, but how can journalists too leverage on the power of AI to tell disability inclusion stories? A lot of questions coming from my colleagues in the industry.
Thank you so much. So we last year we had a training for journalists on how to report on disability issues. So one, of course, we went through some of the components of the framework, the legal implications, but also how to tell a humanized story for persons with disability. And one of the things that we were discussing with our colleagues who participated in that training is to report on disability from the view or from the point of view of the person living with disability. So you don't sit and assume that you understand. So for example, one of the issues that has been emerging that what do you report? Is the person first or the person first or the disability first? So do you say the person is living a disability or a disabled person? So also the language matters. And so we are also working with the different organizations. So we're not just training journalists, but we're also working with media owners. We want to ensure that they have policies around disability. So if they are recruiting a reporter or an employee who has a disability, are they able to provide the facilities where this person is able to execute their work diligently? But also for journalists who are interested in reporting about disability issues, do they understand the issues? Are they able to interact with the people? Because it is a learning curve. When you start out, there are so many things that you may not know, but are you willing and open to learn? So we are working with the media houses to ensure that one, they develop policies, but also they increase on the quantity and quality of the reports around issues of disability, because media is a key player in one, ensuring that there is awareness, but also that they implement some of these issues that we are talking about. I don't know if I've answered that question or there's another one that I need to respond to, if you can remind me.
I think you've answered it, Paul. I think maybe as we finish,
Yes.
the main question is what next now that we have this?
Thanks a lot, Ian. So what next is one, already we have, of course, the first framework that was tested and we did research. For this one, we have already given out some grants to 3 organizations, Kickstart in Kenya, Signs of Hope in Zimbabwe, and then FAMOD in Mozambique, to try and use some of the indicators in their work. So as CIPESA, we run a fund called Africa Digital Fund. So we are using some of the money in that fund to try and test out the indicators. So we'll be calling out for applications, requests for proposals for individuals who are interested in testing, if not all the indicators, but maybe if you identify one that we think is within your area of expertise and interest, you want to test it out. So look out for our call for proposals, where we shall be giving out small grants for people to try and test out this particular framework. So first step is one, to give people some bit of money, but also if you have some funding within your organization and you think some of the questions that are being proposed within the framework are relevant for you, you can use the indicators. It is free, open source. If you want training and capacity building, we are available to work with you, because we are developing expertise, because we have already people who have reviewed this framework. We have Dr. Dianah, Dr. Karen, and Dr. Busuulwa, who graciously reviewed and provided expert knowledge on this area. So we shall provide expertise on how to use the guidelines, but also we are looking for funding. We have some funding, but also looking for more funding to make sure that we roll out this particular research on the framework. And once that research comes in, we'll again work with you to develop advocacy strategies and communication strategies to see that your capacity is built and you are able to work. Because as CIPESA, we believe that the more the merrier, because if we have many people who are working on these issues, it becomes quite easy. We raise a critical mass that can push for the rights of persons with disability, particularly if there are people who are living with disability, because when they speak, it is more believable. They are listened to, their message becomes more authentic than if it is Paul who is speaking, just as because he's an academic.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. And I can see a final comment here from Esther Busiku, who says, thank you for convening this webinar. And she's asking whether will we be availed with a launch document? I think that that will be shared by the CIPESA team. Well, special thanks to the speakers, Dr. Dianah Msipa, we've had Dr. Karen Smit, we've had Dr. Abdul, Busuulwa, Titilola, Olatunde, as well as Ahouty, Kouakou, Morgan Frost, and Paul Kimumwe. Thank you very much for your time and, of course, taking us through this very, very significant and important conversation. And, of course, we're looking at the Day for Persons with Disabilities, which was yesterday, with a special focus on digital inclusion for persons with disabilities. My name is Dianah. I'm a journalist with the BBC. It's been my pleasure hosting this discussion. I do wish you a lovely rest of your day from wherever you've joined us from. Thank you very much.